Okay, welcome to the stream. I think this is all correctly set up. Good morning to anybody who joins or watches the VOD. Good morning, and I'm not quite... I usually stream on a Tuesday. I don't usually stream on a Monday, but I have appointments tomorrow. Hello, CB. So yeah, streaming on Monday morning feels a little like I'm not quite ready for it, but I didn't want to miss streaming this week, so I thought I'd swap to Monday rather than the usual Tuesdays. But I'm definitely still in brain. Brain hasn't kickstarted into gear yet. But the stream today is a specific one for the first hour at the very least. We'll see if we go for the full 2 hours or whether we sort of end after an hour. But we certainly intend to, for the first hour of the stream, talk a little bit out loud. If there are questions, we'll answer questions, but talk a little bit out loud about the designers in open source software diary studies, which there was a wonderful publishing of Penpot do their open... what is it called? Open chat, I think. And they published that recently. So Penpot are a fantastic open source design prototyping tool. And they have these... they do a lot of different work in the community. They don't just maintain a tool. It's quite nice. It's quite nice that they're very involved in the overarching kind of open source and design space. But yes, they had a podcast slash... I don't know whether it's still a podcast if you end up using video content as well. I guess that's called something specific. Something else specific. I don't know what that's called. I guess like maybe it's again a stream. But yes, I am going to share my screen in just a second, and we're going to talk about the Designer Diary study a little bit, just out loud, just so that there's a nice little record of a video of me chatting about it, because I've done a few talks about it, but they're very condensed talks, and we might even break out the prepared slide deck, which is multiple slides long. I don't know if this is a good little tip for people that are preparing conference talks for tech conferences, but when I prepare a talk, and I know that I have a lot of content for a particular kind of topic, sometimes I'll do like different versions of that tech talk, and for the Designer Diary studies I started off by doing a version of that piece of work, that talk essentially, that is minimum an hour long talk, which would be exhausting for listeners and speakers, to be honest, but very, very useful in the sense that it's a useful sort of piece of documentation to send to folks if they are curious about a sort of digestible version of the open source designers contributing to open source diary studies piece of work. But let me see if I can find that, just in case we end up wanting to use it. As is customary, we thought we had all of the things open ready for stream today, but we don't always anticipate the other things that we might need. Have I helpfully named one long and named one short? That would be incredibly helpful. Gosh, so many presentations in my drive. They're actually really difficult to find the one that I need. But maybe we'll also dig down into some of the data as well, because I think we made the data for the Open Source Designer Diary studies available as well. All that data is openly available, and so it is citable in research. We have yet to publish it. Here's the long version of the slides. We have yet to publish it on sort of a peer-reviewed place, although we have options, because it's not a peer-reviewed piece of work, because it hasn't gone through sort of like an academic procedure. Oh yes, you stay and listen. Thank you for being here. It feels like I'm not so much talking to myself when there's at least one person in the chat. But yeah, okie dokie. I'm just gonna close down a couple of programs before I share my screen, and we're gonna jump into talking about the Designer Diary studies after a 6-minute ramble trying to set up and get ready. Okie dokie. So this is the video, the Open Chat with Penpot, episode 3, Designing for Open Source by Superbloom, or the Open Source Designer Diary studies. If you missed it, this got published 3 days ago. I'm just going to drop the link in the chat, just so that folks who maybe watch this back on Twitch get access to the links. So hopefully those are accessible after everything. Well, this will be uploaded onto YouTube, so we'll add it into the description for YouTube as well. I'll get better at doing my YouTube descriptions as well, because they're pretty poor at the moment when I re-upload from Twitch to YouTube. But yeah, it was nice. How many views? Oh, 4,600 views. Good grief, that's quite a lot of views. Good work, Penpot, for your open chat. Great stuff. I don't know how accurate that is to who managed to get through the entire 46-minute conversation between me, Nimishan, and Pablo, but it was a good conversation. We talk a little bit about Penpot as well, because it is Penpot's open chat, so it makes sense to talk about Penpot, and also quite a good amount of the findings of the diary study was some of it was tooling related, and so I'll just drop the repository here in the chat as well. So we've got a public repository. This is also incredibly welcome for contributions, comments, discussions, or if there are any issues people want to raise. So the README is fairly, I think, fairly comprehensive for people that are curious. As far as like a contributing, did I actually create a contributing.md? I haven't. That's probably something that I should look at doing. Actually, let's just open an issue while we're here. To create a contributing document for the top level of this repo. How can people get involved and contribute? Because there are ways that a lot of people can contribute to this. In fact, there's one way specifically that people can contribute that is a way that somebody has already contributed, which is creating an annotated version of the document. So in the folder annotated documents, which will become much more self-explanatory once there is a contributing MD with some guidance on how to do this. But there is a folder called annotated documents, and here there is a uploaded PDF file, and it will look suspiciously like the PDF file of the report. But as you get down into certain sections, and I'm not actually sure when the first annotation is, but we'll get there eventually. This is, yes, as you can see, this is a version that has been annotated by somebody, and it has a certain amount of their own kind of written notes in this document. So one way that people can contribute to the open source software, the Designers in Open Source Software Diary Studies is to read the documentation or read the report and make annotations on the document and kind of upload their own versions of the annotated documents into the folder here, annotated documents. So in here we have another folder, just to kind of go through the folder structure first of this project in the repository that's hosted on GitHub. So we have a folder which is the raw data, or just the data that we used to formulate the report, which I'll go through as we do a walkthrough on the report. But we do have 3 different formats of the data used to inform the report, which are 10 to 16 weeks of diary entries by designers doing contributions to open source. And if I just move over to some of the slide information, just because it's here and readily available, we did the diary studies with 5 different people, 5 different designers in open source. We had more applications than we did selections of people for the diary studies. I believe we had between 12 to sort of just under 20 submissions, which is pretty good for essentially a function within open source that is not as prevalent as other contributions to open source, like code, documentation, QA, any other things that are more sort of, for lack of a better term, popular contributions to open source, or you could just say more prevalent contributions to open source than designers. So it was pretty good that we got that many submissions. We did a reasonably good amount of promo, trying to sort of encourage people to make applications to participate in the diary studies. But if anybody's ever tried to do a diary study before, or studied diary studies as a form of design, user research, design, information collecting, they are very labor intensive. We paid our participants, so that was one of the reasons we could only select 5 people. We paid them. We think we paid them a pretty decent stipend for the amount of time that we asked for, because we tried to structure the diary study in a way that was least interruptive. Is that a word? That interrupted their lives the least. So essentially we asked for just a weekly summary of what they'd done that week, essentially, across a number of different question criteria. And we actually really struggled, me and Nimisha, at the beginning of setting up this diary study, because there are so many different things that we want to ask designers that are contributing to open source, and we wanted to ask them in a more formal data capture way, essentially. So a lot of these questions are all things that at the time when me and Nimisha were talking about this diary study. Oh, and you can find Nimisha. Nimisha is on social medias. I believe if I just grab their Twitter account just for a quick second, and then so if you want to follow Nimisha does amazing work as well. She's working over at Nextcloud as a designer at the moment, I believe, but she does a lot of other kind of bits and pieces of work. She was a volunteer. She volunteered time to help out with this diary study. So she actually kind of wasn't paid by the organization, my organization that I work for. She was volunteering time so that she could kind of be involved in this process. But yeah, we were talking about the kinds of questions that we wanted to ask designers, and these are questions that me and Nimisha and many other designers in open source have discussed informally, although I can't speak for everyone in the open source design community, but these are all questions that that I've heard curiosities about before. But we had to be really selective with what we wanted to ask, because we structurally what we did was we set up a number of different Google surveys, even though we would have we also have open source alternatives for survey tools, where I work at the Superbloom, the organization where I work. But those kind of open source survey tools are not as user friendly as Google is. And unfortunately, we as an organization, well, not unfortunately, it's a necessity that as an organization we end up using a lot of Google Suite tools. We do use open source software survey tools when it's critical that we self-host information. So we definitely don't want any kind of risk that Google has access to things. But in this case, we were asking for the amount of information that we were asking from the designers that participated in the study was whatever they felt most comfortable giving, because I think one of the first pieces, or one of the first conversations that me and Nimisha had, where we think that even the most forthcoming, the most uncensored kind of designers in open source can feel nervous or unsure critiquing open source software, either as the tooling or how the design is done of the tooling, or how the organizations, the open source projects and organizations are structured. Because we, as designers in open source, we're already at a sort of socially less accepted level, essentially. So designers in open source kind of are either like seen as like, in the best case scenario, and the most positive scenario, they are seen as like a curiosity. Like, it's not uncommon to be welcomed into an open source software project as a designer. It's even not uncommon nowadays to be welcomed in and have like a very good structure and understanding of what kind of design an open source software project wants to work on or have contributions to. But those usually are the bigger open source software foundations or organizations that have a lot of resources and have a lot of ability to pull in resources or have notoriety. Or they're projects that just haven't, they can be a lot smaller projects, but they can just have had a better onboarding experience into design for whatever reason that is. So anyway, there's so much to talk about with this study. It's one of the things that's really hard is to stay on track. So yes, we paid our participants. We could have studied with many more participants, but diary studies take quite a significant amount of time, even when you're trying to limit the amount of questions that you're asking people in diary studies. You're still asking them to do a weekly sort of report back on what they experienced, what they were doing. In some circumstances, diary studies are even sort of done on a daily basis, or even sometimes like an ad hoc kind of you choose when to sort of ask the participant to give you information, like within a sort of set kind of period of time. Like maybe you sometimes you can what's the word, like page them and just kind of say, hey, we want to know what you're working on like right now. Those are typically like the old-fashioned kind of pager design diary studies. But anyway, so these are the sort of demographics of the people. Hello, Tomazu, nice to see you here. These are the demographics of the designers that participated in the diary study. These are the sort of demographics that we feel like are useful and interesting and appropriate to know. But just going back to that folder structure, this is this is all the raw data that people can use themselves. They can synthesize and try and understand the meaning of themselves, should they want to, and that have had all of the as much of the personal identifying information, PII, removed as possible. So to go back to that sort of comment around when we were formulating questions, or when we even wanted to do this diary study with designers, one of the things that we were curious about was if we maintain the ability to stay anonymous, and the ability to kind of freely talk about the organizations that these designers are, the open source organizations and projects these designers are contributing to. Does that afford the designers a level of security in being more honest and forthcoming with like their experiences and thoughts and feelings around doing design contributions? So yeah, making sure that you pay people if you can to do diary studies. Making sure that if you are able to keep them anonymous as possible. One of the things that I really struggled with thinking about in this is I really do want to name the organizations that people are referring to in this. I mostly, in most cases, I abstract those organizations that they're actively contributing to the kind of nature of the organization, if that kind of makes sense, especially in the raw data files. So just on screen at the moment, I haven't abstracted the tooling that designers use, or the platforms that designers use in order to contribute design, because those are kind of like the tools, the platforms that are used to contribute design, not the open source tools that they are contributing to. So you will find references to GitHub, GitLab, Penpot, Inkscape, other Figma as a non-open source software alternative in the report, but what you won't see are the names of organizations. So for example, this quote from one of the designers around promoting a practice of openness or doing design in the open. There is a comment here from one of the designers in the diary study, which is they shared a document with the team at the open source software community organization for the other designers to make inputs on. So what I'm trying to do is remove that organization's name, which would have been where the bracket information is there, open source software community organization. And I've tried to describe what kind of open source software was being contributed to there. So in this case, it was an open source software community related organization. So not necessarily a open source software, a dev tools open source software, or a operating system open source software. So I've tried to kind of still keep some relevant information, but remove that connection to a particular named open source software. Removing personal identifying information from this data was notoriously difficult, though, especially when you're doing user research gathering, insight gathering from a sample of people which are relatively rare, right? So the reason that I've abstracted the organization names in a lot of the information is because there's probably only one or two designers over the period of time that we did this that are contributing to this specific open source software organization. So even abstracting it to the kind of open source software organization still narrows it down to a reasonably small pool of actual real people. If you were determined, you could try and discover who those people are. But I still think that we've done as much as we possibly can to make sure that those designers stay protected and they're able to talk about the challenges that they have when they're contributing to open source software. Because to go back to the demographic information of the people that we studied with, so we've got mostly people that are full-time or working full-time, some people that are working part-time. So whether or not that this is their employment status, regardless of whether it's at an open source software organization or not. So this kind of just describes the nature of their sort of their socioeconomic situation, let's say, which is important when we're thinking about contributions to open source, since contributions to open source are so often seen as not reimbursed in many ways. So typically they're volunteer contributions that are made. There are more, I think, in the raw data, I think there's more demographic related information about like whether they are paid by open source software organizations to work on certain things, or whether they are only make volunteer contributions. Because I think this is regardless of designer or not designer, it's actually, I find it quite interesting to understand like the volume and regularity to which contributors to open source software are paid for their contributions, and in what ways are they paid? Are they paid like to maintain? Are they paid to do specific issues? Are they or specific work? It's an interesting factor, especially since to relate that to a design topic. There is a lot of I'm not saying that this isn't common in other industries and functions too, but within design there is a historic unpleasant topic around unpaid labor and unpaid work, and especially when you're in creative, potentially, or regarded as in creative services, so like graphics, UI design, anything that sort of is could be described as creative expression, whereas actually a lot of design is based on like hypothesis, like kind of more of a scientific method of like hypothesis generation, validation, and then like implementation of those findings, which is a misinterpretation sometimes of how design gets built. But yeah, there's a huge sort of part of design which is regarded as fun. So you shouldn't be paid for something that you find creative and fun and expressive, right? I think that can also happen in other kinds of contributions, right? Like if you have a real kind of anybody that any function that has like finds the thing that they do fun, they tend to find it hard to also be reimbursed well for that. There's also this information on whether they are students or not, or postgraduates, like some kind of educational status. And then also like the quantity over their contribution life cycle. So not necessarily in the study, but like how many open source software projects they have contributed to over their sort of lifetime of contribution to open source. So there's a very different sort of volume of projects that have been contributed to. So here's, I believe there is so there's a little README about the raw data. If you'd like to use it in any way, then you can drop me an email on my organizational email if you want to use the raw data or like analyze the raw data yourselves from this diary study. For any kind of purpose, whether it be academic or otherwise, that would be really interesting. So we also have a number of other files in this repository that are kind of unsorted as of yet. They could do with a good time for me doing some sorting. We have our typical README and we have our typical license that we need. We have a few sort of preparation documents that I just kind of want to refer to before we dig into the report. We have, I think it's one of the things that I believe in is if you are successful with how you ask for funding from an organization to do some really critical work, I think it's always good to make that open. I made the proposal document that I put into Ocean, which funded this work in 2021. This is the original proposal that I pitched to them. This is how I originally wanted to fund a larger project. We got a lot, much reduced. funding than what we asked for. But I still kind of mapped out what a much larger project could be. But the things that might be interesting to people that are looking to fund similar work are like how the research relates and what impact the research has, and some of the proposal details about making sure that we are doing research with designers that are contributing to open source software. If I look off to the side, it's because we have a sick cat in the household today. So I'm just keeping an eye on our sick kitty. So yeah, there's the original proposal. There's survey information, which is this, I believe, what details? Oh, so this is a survey that we so talking about the privacy and removing personal identifying information. We actually asked people. We assumed that people would want to be anonymous by default, but we also asked them, like, so do you want all references to names completely and heavily like generalized, or do you want project names remaining? So we actually asked people what level of privacy they want, because we also understand that information could be useful, and if the people that are offering this information as part of a paid research study, they may want that information publicly available for a period of time. We also gave them the option to change their mind within any kind of set period of time, just to let us know, and we'll redact the information if they want it public for a certain amount of time, and then to go private, that would be fine. But everyone sort of went with the default privacy, maximum sort of privacy thing. There's also a few things in here that are just really useful, possibly. So we did a lot of our we did a lot of different communications across communication channels. So as I've mentioned before, we used Google Forms to actually collect the diary study entries, but we also set up a open Zoom room with our professional organizational Zoom account that anybody could drop into at any time to record a vocal response to the survey, or just talk about their experience that week if they wanted to. So people could choose to kind of give us information in lots of different ways, which is always I think a good thing to do with diary studies. I mean, it sort of depends on how strict because we weren't academically we weren't going through like an academic peer review process. If you're going through like a peer review process, you probably have to, like, I would assume that you are maintaining the integrity of the data. So you want you want the data capture information to be consistent, essentially, or as consistent as possible given circumstances. But yeah, we offered a few different ways where people could input, because we also recognized that this was a big ask, essentially, for people to offer this information. So yeah, we made these notifications for things like Slack or emails. So again, if people are looking at doing this kind of diary study themselves, there's a lot of like template information, a lot of templated assets that you can use, essentially, which is part of like the theory of openness that Superbloom as an organization has. So there's the version of the Google form, which hopefully should still work. Yes, it does. There we go. Perfect. So this is the blank like template version of the Google form that we used each week, and we created like from week 1 to week like 16 versions of that Google form where people can send in information. But this is also just a text version of the things that we asked, essentially. So actually, it would be really good on the stream, just because we have time in the stream, just to go through the questions that we asked people to input on the diary studies, because when people access or see the talks about the designer diary studies, they're seeing like a 20-minute condensed version of basically, or if you watch the open chat with Penpot, you're basically hearing, we did a diary study, we did it with designers contributing to open source, here's all the things that we did, from synthesizing the research, here's all the things that we found. we never get to go into like the detail about how we set up the study, what questions we're asking. So it'd be really nice to kind of go through that stuff on stream. I think it's interesting. But we also will go through the things that we discovered as we go through the repository. So yeah, we had a few different sections every week. Oh, and the thing that I just wanted to say about the weekly submissions. So the other flexibility that we offered the diary study respondents was we wanted to collect 10 weeks of information. Ideally, we'd collect 10 weeks in a row of information. Like, so we started, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think we started in November of 2022, which feels like a really long time ago now. We started in November of 2022. We may have started in December of 2022. And we went through kind of to March 2023. Yes, years are a little bit fuzzy now when they're that kind of that many years ago. But yeah, December 2022 through to March 2023. There we go. But what we didn't want to say that you absolutely have to do 10 weeks in a row, because life happens, and diary studies, again, as we've said multiple times, are quite a large time commitment. We anticipated that people would take maybe anything from maybe about 10 minutes to even like half an hour, 40 minutes to complete this form, depending on how much information or how much text they wrote or how much response they had to a particular question. That was kind of up to them. We didn't say like you have to answer every question every week, because one level of flexibility was you don't have to do the 10 weeks in a row. So if you miss a week, especially since over the diary study period of time, we had a Christmas holiday for a lot of the participants that observed Christmas as a holiday, and also New Year was observed by a number of different people, both the New Year at the end of December into January, but also the New Year that is observed, I believe, in February time. For East Asian countries, if I'm not mistaken. So we had a number of different holidays that were observed because we had a pretty good global spread of people, if I'm not mistaken. We had the USA and Canada covered. We had country in South America, we had then a country in Europe, and we also had a country in Africa represented as diary study participants. So we had everything. The only sort of region that we were we were missing a number of different regions, but it would have been good to get some diary responses from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and kind of Australia area, and it would also be great to get more information from lots of different countries, honestly. But so yeah, participants didn't need to respond the 10 weeks in a row. So some people did do 10 weeks in a row, and then some people took a couple of weeks off because they were on vacation. And some people needed to kind of spread their 10-week responses over the period of like 16 weeks. So that was totally fine with us. But we did make it really clear to our participants that we weren't... This was a really interesting early finding when we did... if I go back to the main repository, one of the things that we did before we started gathering the diary study responses is we did 45-minute like introduction interviews with different people, which are all transcribed here. So there again, all of the data is anonymized. Each person has been given a kind of code name. This does again go into some detail about like what they've used and how they use it, a few sort of links to various people, but it has kind of been anonymized as much as possible. But this like 45-minute call that we had was like this, like, we asked a series of questions. We asked, how long have you been doing contributions to open source? How did you start in design? What open source software do you contribute to and participate in? How do you decide on a project that you'd like to work on or contribute to? Do you contribute as a paid or a volunteer or both, and in what ratio? If you're paid for open source software, how does this feel? If you're not paid for open source software, how does this feel? What kind of design do you find yourself doing the most or spending the most time on? Is it UX, UI, research, other? What tools and software do you use for your contributions? What kind of processes and communication happens between you and others that work on the open source software, and who else works on the open source software? When does communication work well? When does communication not work well or falter? Are there other designers or people that are interested in design in the open source software project that you're primarily contributing to right now for the diary study? This was, and then thinking ahead to when you might stop contributing to open source software projects that you do, how would you like to leave that project? Like what would the design be, what state would design be left in as you leave that project? And so we had those calls with each of the participants just to kind of get an understanding of like how they were coming into the diary study. Again, those transcripts are all open there as the 45-minute interview transcripts. I believe actually I need to close a number of different issues with those transcripts in. And we've already had somebody that's asking whether it will be peer reviewed, which I hope at some point it can be. But I need some advice from academic people on how to get something that's already been done, like peer reviewed, essentially. Anyway, so yes, going back to the diary entry survey. So this is all here. These are all the questions that we then asked on a weekly basis, essentially. What week is this diary study response for? They can either like describe it as week 1 to week 5, etc., or the date period that they are responding to. They can link if they have a video or audio response instead of a written response. And then we go into section 2, which was a lot of the questions, and I think we tried to section this like thematically, if I'm not mistaken. So the first section is about your open source software contributions this week. So questions about the contribution or work that they did this week. So what are the top 3 or more tasks that you worked on this week as a designer contributing to open source software? And then a bit of like support text on like, you know, guidance on what to respond with. Because I think one of the really interesting things that I still remember about this is when we said that we're really interested in, we don't mind if you skip weeks, like to take vacation. We don't really mind how you do your 10 weeks, where we just want 10 weeks of information from you. But some of the designers were worried that there were going to be weeks where they made no contributions to open source software, especially those that were primarily unpaid open source software contributors. And I think that's something that any person contributing to open source software can relate to. There are going to be weeks where you do nothing related to your open source software contributions. And they were like, should we still submit a report for that week? And it's like, yeah, we are as interested in the weeks where you are making like active contributions of stuff, whatever that is, as we are interested in the weeks where you don't make contributions to open source software. And this will become more clear that I believe there's a question in the weekly report which are the things that kind of got in the way of making contributions to open source software, or the things that made contributing to open source software difficult, like outside of the open source software and also inside of the open source software, if that makes sense. Because we're interested in what's going on in designers' lives. Like, our contributions to open source software can't really be contained just within the open source software project. There are going to be other things that are happening in life that impact our ability to contribute to open source software, whether we're being paid or unpaid for those contributions. So we're interested in what those factors are and how we can understand them better, essentially, is what we tried to tell the designers. But a lot of the designers also were like, well, what if my design contributions aren't like complete or aren't very good, or like, what if they're work in progresses, or what if there are these kinds of things which don't feel, and this gets into a really tricky topic, but they don't feel like contributions yet. We said we're just interested in what you want to describe as like your work on open source software contributions that week. So we didn't say that it has to be a certain kind of level of contribution. It has to, well, it certainly, for design, it certainly doesn't have to have a PR, a pull request related to it, because often design contributions are unable to be contributed via a pull request. So yeah, it's not pull requests made are not a measurement of successful pull requests merged are not a successful measurement of design contribution. It can't be right now, currently. So we wanted to just know about the various tasks that people worked on. What is a single challenge that they wanted to highlight? So we know that we knew from the interviews and from our own experience that there are a number of challenges to doing design contributions. We wanted them to highlight one single challenge if they, or multiple if they felt like empowered to give us more information. But we quantified it as just one single one, just so that we could also keep the time that we were asking people to do the diary studies like time boxed, essentially, as best we could. It could be any challenge that they faced. It didn't have to be related to the design part of what they were doing. It could be related to something else to do with the open source software. And what was a single success they wanted to highlight, contributing to an open source software project. Roughly what types of design did they spend what percentage of time on, and how do they feel about that ratio? So I was particularly interested in like whether they spent, or whether they thought their time was spent mostly on what we kind of affectionately call, in Superbloom especially, but in the kind of wider open source software design space, as like advocacy for design, or like design proficiency, like leveling up design proficiency within open source software organizations or projects, which is more about like, I'm going to do this kind of design contribution in this way, and this is why it's good and important for this open source software project. And sometimes you spend more time explaining what you're going to do and why it's useful than actually doing the thing that is the design contribution. So I was curious about the percentage of time that designers spent on various different things. What tools, software, and products did they use? We were interested in open source tools as well as non-open source tools that designers used. In fact, we were equally interested in whatever kind of tool that people use to produce design contributions. Did any users of the open source software tool that they contribute to get involved in contribution or other aspects of the open source software tool this week? Or did you speak to any users this week? So essentially with this question, what we're asking is, was there participation from other people within the open source software around design contribution or their own contribution? Or did they have any like interaction with what they would consider as users? Did any other people, developers, maintainers, documentation writers, etc., in the open source software project contribute to design? So the first question is about getting involved in the contribution. So that might describe something like commenting, talked in a communication channel, done some user testing, something like that. And then the second question, number 10, is about whether they have been more involved in the design contribution. What was their primary role and how did they get involved? But yeah, there are a few examples here of how you can define what a design contribution from another member of the community looks like. But some examples might be a developer commenting on UI design, either in like a comment thread in an issue or in like a design tool, essentially. Users providing feedback on accessibility, participating in a user research workshop or something like that. This was one of my favorite questions, and I think one of the things that I was saddest about with this project that we couldn't make openly available for protection, like privacy, security reasons of our participants. But we asked them if they were comfortable to paste links to either like open, like publicly viewable issues, design files, documents, projects, essentially, that they had been working on that week. And I think it was so cool to eventually see people just like sharing like design files with us and kind of talking through their design files, or like user research documents that they were in the process of writing, or graphics that they were in the process of building for projects. And to see like the difference between what kinds of things people were sharing. So whether designers were linking to issues in repositories, whether that was a specific design repository, or whether it was a project-wide repository, or whether they kind of were linking to design files like Figma links or Penpot links or other links. And it kind of gives us a sense of like quantifiable, like numbers-based information about how frequently these different designers were working in the open source spaces that the other open source contributors were working in. So we can make a deduction that when a designer is sharing a link, even an openly viewable link that is either like, say, a Penpot link or a Figma link or a Google document link or like a text document link of some description, or any kind of file that isn't, let's kind of define this as on an open source repository. So either an issue or a PR or, discussion, maybe even a discussion tab on this you can have on GitHub or something else. You can sort of say, well, this is like operating in the space that open source already operates in, and this is like operating in a space where design operates typically. And it sort of like gives us an understanding of like where the frequency of how often designers are operating in the open source, established open source software spaces, and how frequently they're using other tools essentially to produce what they need to produce. And I'm sure that there's tons of research that can be done just about that question, and tons of like innovation that could happen, or like interesting things that could happen to a lot of tooling to improve that process. But we found out so much information from this study that I'm surprised it was even able to kind of be condensed into a 40-page report, to be fair. Then we asked about processes, methods, and practices. Did they get the time or the resources that they needed to produce or work on the open source software project this week? Did the design work this week follow a process that they were satisfied with? If not, what small change would you make to improve it? This question came about from like, often designers have like methods that they've either used before, they think are particularly successful, or they'd like to try. And sometimes bringing these methods in to an open source space can be confusing for the open source software project, or outright rejected by the open source software project. So we were curious about like what base level processes designers were coming into those spaces with. and kind of how that was met by the other people in the open source software project, and like whether that was met, you know, gracefully, whether it was met aggressively, whether the designers were satisfied, if they had to modify a process for whatever reason. Then we can kind of, from that question, we can begin to think about like what methods and processes work in what open source software spaces and why. Or we could, if we had, you know, more research budget to do so. Which is, I guess, one of the biggest things to take away from this report, or this piece of research that we did, is this is like barely scratching the surface of all the different things that we could find out, that we could improve, that we could work on in relation to this kind of topic of designers in open source software. How do you determine the success, if applicable, to the processes and methods and practice that they used? Did you do anything this week or do anything to make your design or the same amount of open this week? So another question we were really curious about was how readily are designers participating in the open, or like what we could describe as like established open ways of practicing in open source, and what ways are they trying to make design more open or maintain a same level of open, or like what does openness mean within the design, within design in open source? Because we often kind of hear, oh, design should be more open, or it could be more open. There's lots of things that we can do, but we rarely ask that, like, what are designers actually trying to do? And how is that met? And how is that served? Anyway, there's a lot of shoulda, woulda, couldas in open source, and there's not a lot of how are people trying right now, and what is useful and successful. Are there any tools, softwares, processes, or methods that limited you in your contributions this week, and how did they limit you? So this was interesting. This is like, are the tools working for you with your contributions, or is you struggling with the software or methods limiting people? So the example that we have here for this question is, I tried to share a user research plan outline this week, but in a markdown text file, people cannot see the sections I needed feedback on clearly. So I used a Google document, which is also difficult as not everyone wants to use Google accounts. So that's kind of like an example of what might have limited a contribution. So this is a very real problem for designers doing like user research documents or user testing documents or usability documents. You can create those in Markdown because they're text. Often they're text files, so that is writing. Very rarely maybe diagrams or something like that, but you also can put, you know, drawn diagrams, JPEGs, etc. into Markdown files. But the thing that you can't do in Markdown files, or it's harder to do, you could probably do through like comments in the pull requests, is like comments and having conversations about particular sections of user research and why it's important. Or like some of the text formatting that we kind of get into. It kind of, to some extent, user research documents can kind of get into a sort of an if statement scenario. So if answer to this question is, user research question is, looks like X, then if X, then ask Y. If not X, then ask Z. So there can be quite a complicated logic to user research documents sometimes, which is often easier to do in documents like Google Documents, right? You could do that in Markdown, but it would take a lot longer, I think, for a lot of people. You'd have to figure out how to do those things. What are the hacks or processes that people have tried this week to problem solve or reduce time on repetitive or tedious tasks? So an example of this is recording a video of a design file in a UX Flow and speaking over the top of it to get feedback. So often this example comes from experience of like, often when you sort of send a design file for feedback or like a flow of like user experience screens for open source, or not even open source, proprietary if you're working proprietary, but often it's hard for the person that's viewing that design file to understand a lot of the context, the reasoning, the choices that were made, especially if those choices were made based off of user research. One of the best ways or one of the interesting ways that designers have gotten around this in open source is as well as providing a link to a design file, they record a audio or video response, or as they talk through the design, just to give that like context, that walkthrough context, which is really, really useful in a lot of ways. So we're on to section 4. So already you can sort of understand we're actually asking quite a lot of questions on a weekly basis. This was a reduced series of questions. So section 4 is collaboration and communication. So this is again just questions about how the communication was across the open source software project, and then what, if any, key design or project decisions were made this week in the open source software, and who made these decisions and how did they get made, which was something that we were really interested in, how designers are participating in decision making around design and product, but also like where is the implicit or explicit hierarchy within product decision making in open source. Okay, we're on to section 5. What else outside of the open source software projects needs compete for your attention and time? So this is the question or the statement that I was mentioning earlier on, which is we don't only exist as a human contributing to open source software. We have lives and other things to focus on our attention and time on. So these kinds of things, we were just kind of like, what are the things that are competing for your attention when you're doing open source software contributions or thinking about them? And then 2 sort of aspirational questions. What are you looking forward to next week in the open source software project? And anything else you'd like to tell us about the last week that you think is important. So if there wasn't really a question, if there was something that they wanted to tell us that didn't really fit under a question, they could tell us in that. Anything else. But what you're looking forward to next week in the open source software project is not just like a aspirational question. This was a question where we also looked at the answers to this question in week 1. So say in week 1, one of the designers was, I'm really looking forward to having more conversations about this design implementation and like seeing this begin to be implemented maybe in the open source software, just as an example. And then what we'd do is we'd look at the responses in week 2 where they were looking forward to that in week 1, and then in week 2 we'd see like whether that expectation got met from the designer by the open source software. And we were one of the things that we still could do with the data that we have is like map that, like, so how frequently was the expectation that the designer had of what they were looking forward to in the following week actually, how frequently did it actually happen? From a sort of from memory, I don't think that expectation or that thing that they were looking forward to was often met. I think it was maybe a handful of times across the 5 people over the 10 to 16 weeks, maybe that it sort of did happen, but and maybe only like once or twice in a very like hurrah successful way. I don't think it was very often that the things that the designers were looking forward to that happening the next week actually happened in that next week. And also often I think the responses often to that question were very cautious, like, oh, we really just don't expect to get the things that we want to happen within a time frame that feels good for us, essentially. Anyway, that's that's a lot of the stuff that I don't get to talk about when I'm going through the talk version, like the 20 to 30 minute talk version of this work. But you can go back and look at that weekly survey. So that's all available in the repository. And the last things that are important within this repository is the actual report. So we have a couple of other things in this repository. We have so that'll be okay, so we've got that one. Oh, so this is the registration information sheet. This is another thing if folks are looking, this is the expression of interest, or the letter of interest essentially, that we were doing recruitment for. So what we sent to people, like if they were interested. There's also slide deck ODP ODP files in here, and a PDF file as well of the various slide decks that I've made. The slide decks just have slightly prettier, I would say, like from a Superbloom brand perspective, they just have slightly prettier sort of like condensed versions of the report, so that can be used by people. And then we've got the findings report in a Markdown file, so this is just pure Markdown. And then we've also got 2 PDF files we've got of the report. So we've got the original one here, which is just the title. You can sort of see just the general title here, which still needs a cleanup because it appears to have 2 period full stops. And then we've got version 2, which I believe is just typo corrections for the PDF report. So in the findings.report.md, I think the typos also got fixed, but through a PR, so you can see the history. But with PDFs, you just do multiple versions. One of the things that I could have just re-uploaded the PDF with like the corrections on the typos, but when we're doing like PDF versioning, I was like, okay, well, let's just, put versions on there. It's always hard to do version control with anything that isn't sort of text or code, I suppose. So that's all the different files within the repository that we've just gone through. So we're gonna take a little tour through the report now. We're already past the first hour, but we're just gonna take a really quick tour through it, because I would encourage people that if they want to learn more about the details of the report, essentially the report focuses more on what we deduced, what we discovered, and what we understood as a team of people analysing the data. So there's a little bit at the beginning of the report, which is just like, these are our general research questions, a bit about who funded us, like a pretty quick part about like the structure of the study, including like those 45-minute interview questions that we had, who we studied with and kind of their various demographics, and then some of the questions that we asked in the interview study at the beginning, like in the report. So how did designers first become involved? Like there's a little bit of really interesting mapping that can be done about like different organizations, entryway organizations for designers into open source. So some people arrived as a designer in open source through learning coding languages like Ruby. Some came through design communities like design buddies. Some people came through academic programs from institutions like OpenRIT at the Rochester Institute of Technology. So there are a number of different ways that designers entered into open source. I find this set of questions really fascinating, because I actually think that these are some of these or a lot of these sections. What we tend to do in Superbloom is, when we do some kind of research, is we try and make sure that we not only like report on what we found in kind of a long form text kind of way, but we also distill what we found into like recommendations, essentially. So we try and condense what we discovered into if you care about this, we think you can do this, and this will help solve the thing that you care about. So we have tried to, as an organization, Superbloom tries to make like this kind of information accessible to open source software projects, especially the ones that don't necessarily have as many resources as larger foundations or larger projects. But that being said, one of the things that I found fascinating is how do designers decide whether they'd like to contribute to or work on an open source software project. And basically these are, from this selection of designers, these are the key questions that they were interested in asking themselves as they sort of experienced an open source software project. So as they like went through the repository, as they, oh hey Diaz, how's it going? It's real early for you. Or maybe it's late, maybe you stayed up late. But yeah, maybe they're participating in a community related thing. Anyway, so these are the questions that our designers are asking themselves as they think about contributing to a different particular project. So they are interested in whether it's clear what the open source software project wants from a designer or design. Do they have specific problems that they want solved by the designer? And if I remember correctly, like the more easily accessible that information, the better. So say if an open source software project has that kind of information in the top level structure of their like repository. So for example, like in one of these like key files here, or a folder labeled, or even just like in the README and not too far scrolling down the README, if like that kind of question is able to be answered, is what would you want a designer to work on? The sort of second place where designers will look, if they know where to look, is things like the issues. And again, I don't know, one of the things that would be good to find out more detail on is like how designers navigate certain projects. Like if we're talking about the aspirations of future aspects of this research, one of the aspects would be like more in-depth observations. Like, so as the designer is like looking at a repository, are they filtering by labels to try and find issues for themselves? Are they raising issues if they don't see anything that they can work on? Why wouldn't they raise an issue? Those kinds of questions. The next question is, are the designers able to actually do that task? Do they think that they have the skills required or are able to learn how to do that task, or a task that the open source software needs? Implicit in that question as well is I think there is a gentle assessment that designers are doing with open source software projects, where they try and figure out if there is a willingness for that designer to learn as they learn a new process in order to make a particular contribution. Or to respond to a particular task. That one's a harder question to kind of ask and answer, because it kind of requires, again, looking through like a series of information. But yeah, it's definitely a tricky question to answer. But there's a sense. I remember having conversations with the designers in the diary study where a lot of the information that they get from open source software projects is like implicit. You could just describe it as vibes, implicit vibes. Like, what are the vibes of this software project? And you can kind of see that in some of this question here, essentially, which is how close is this open source software to my culture or location, like geographical location? Will I be welcomed with my context? Will I be able to contribute in my native language comfortably? Or like, will I be able to contribute comfortably enough with my level of like the language that the open source software mostly operates in, which typically more often than not is English. Is the open source software a one-person project, and is it still active? So it's not a necessity for the open source software project to have more than one person for a designer to be interested in, but it's more like, is there one person or more? Interesting information, good. And is it still active regardless of how many people are like in the project, essentially? Another part of that question, if I remember correctly from one participant, is like, what's the impression that they get of the founder? And is the founder of the project still involved? Is another sort of aspect of that question that at least one participant asked themselves. How in need is the project? Are there others that can do this, or does the project have good enough support to get this done elsewhere? So I think that this is like a tricky question for designers to answer for themselves, because like there's, on the flip side, there's a lot of designers or some people generally that are interested in contributing to a project that can offer them something that they need, experience, or something else that they would like. Sorry, I lagged for a second there, so I just wanted to wait for the connection to stabilize. Yeah, but the designers that we studied with were mostly interested in, does this project really need me? Is it really in need? Are people really struggling to use this if this design aspect isn't improved? And then, does the documentation make sense to me, and can I learn enough about the open source software in order to participate? So this is a lot about like whether or not designers are getting responses like, go read the manual, essentially. If the README and the documentation has a in-depth and not helpful installation process, and designers can't follow or are either can't or don't want to follow that process, can they learn enough about the open source software without following that process, and are they welcomed enough in order to participate with contributing design if they cannot do that process? Because there's a lot of open source software projects that automatically reject people's contributions if they are not users. So you have to be using the thing in order to contribute, whereas that automatically basically isolates and rejects contributions from people that could contribute amazing skills like design, UI, those kinds of things, but they just they will not ever use the tool. It doesn't mean their contributions aren't still useful, good, valid, important contributions. It kind of, a lot of open source software kind of select out people that are unable or just have no reason to install the tool, essentially, which I think is sad, and actually probably one of the main things that needs to be, I don't know, just what's the word? One of the main things that needs to be devalued as a way of doing work in open source. Like, you shouldn't have to be able to deploy install and run the open source software and use it in order to make a valuable contribution. Anyway, so that was a section that I found particularly interesting. A lot of probably the rest of this stream is just going to be me focusing on sections that I find particularly interesting. Every section is honestly incredibly interesting, but there are some sections which I find particularly interesting. There's a whole section about tooling, so this was really useful for people that are developing tools, and it didn't limit just to open source software tools. So there are tons of different tools that a lot of designers are using that are proprietary. And some surprising tools, really. A lot of like coding related tools as well. and different events tools. There were contributors that were getting involved in events that their open source software projects were going to be running. So they were really involved in related software. And then there's a little section here specifically about the design software that they were using. And then, yeah, this one section at the end, notably only one designer described using pen and paper as a tool to complete their work, which, yeah, is interesting to know, essentially. It's kind of like interesting if you are like a designer working outside of the kind of open source software space or outside of like the technology software space. Pen and paper is quite regularly used, I think, still. But yeah, sketching is no longer a thing that people do on pen and paper as much as they do directly in software. This section is about what artifacts, and it's kind of a weird design term, actually. I don't know if this is used in other spaces, industries, but we tend to call like stuff that designers make or people make. It's not always designers, but we tend to call them artifacts. So what artifacts were shared across the 16 weeks? So these are things like documents or issue links or design files or graphics or just artifacts, essentially, we tend to call them. So if that is confusing as a term, that kind of describes the stuff that people were like making. It makes it sound more like what's the word, like we're discovery, like we're historical discovery, like we're doing archaeology, but in the internet, I suppose. This section is really important for folks. I believe that this is one of the sections that PenPot, the designer developer collaboration open source software tool, we're interested in, just about the collaboration between designers and developers. Like, how does collaboration happen? What kinds of ways is it described as? How, well does it work, or anything like that? So yeah, there's some interesting quotes in here. A lot of it about I'm not sure the best way to use either GitHub or GitLab as a designer often, or like I leave that to the other people, because that's other people as in the coders and developers, because that's their kind of domain. There's like a bit of the implicit part of the designer developer collaboration is that the space where the open source software is like hosted, usually like the repository or somewhere where the code is, isn't always explicitly guarded as like a developer only space, and often is like talked about not just being a developer only space. But I think that there is still, because of the absence of other stuff other than code, it still is perpetuated implicitly as a developer only space. It needs to be more multi-purpose if it is to feel like it can be participated in by other people that are not doing code and development work. This is an interesting section as well, the openness practices one. I know Memo Esparza, if you search for a person, Memo, MEMO, Esparza, ESPARZA, I believe, Esparza. Memo is doing some amazing work around the openness practices of designers and trying to just make it better within the design space. So there's kind of like the designer developer collaboration, but then there's also like the openness practices and collaboration just between designers, which still needs to kind of be improved and established. It's not often a thing, and not a thing that kind of came up very regularly in the diary study, like the collaboration between multiple designers. Quite a lot of the designers were solo designers working on things by themselves. There were a couple of instances where the designers had other contributions from designers, and it was like a moment of pure elation for them. Like, oh, another designer worked on this. But there was also like this example here. Another designer took the wrong design file and used an outdated asset in the work, and so that needed to be rolled back and retracted and redone. So I think that this process of like versioning and this process of version control is still something that designers are still getting used to. This is like one of the biggest sections, and actually these are the sections that I talk the most about in the like 20 to 30 minute talks that I've done with by myself or with Namisha about this report, which is about how designers define success, because there's a lot of what came through in the data was this worked or this didn't work, and this is why, and here are examples why. So the biggest I think the biggest success finding that we had within the data was this success via feedback. And it was, the reason is that we got to a very unique description of feedback that is successful for these designers. And I'm just going to bring up the slide for it because I feel like the slide is a little more snappy and clear. So success via feedback. So designers saw their work as successful when the feedback they received was relevant and useful. So designers tended to assume that they got it right, as in they got the design contribution right, and are successful if there are no questions or feedback on their design work. This was less so if the designer did not seem particularly confident on their proposed design. So if they feel confident and nobody responds with any kind of feedback, oh, okay, I got it right, great, I can move on to something else. If they're not confident that they've appropriately addressed the problem, then they are like, did I get it right? But nobody's giving me feedback, so I guess maybe I got it right, I'm not sure. But the designers also viewed slow feedback as negative, and it was seen as a progress blocker. So slow feedback was different for each designer, especially because it's all about the expectations that you set within the open source software repository, documentation, like we respond to, or maintainers respond to issues this frequently, or trying to understand who to also ask for feedback from is tricky. But the relevant and useful, I think the example that I can use for this one should be here. So when I get feedback on what's wrong in my design and the next steps are actionable. Wrong is like a relative term, but if something has, there can be things that are wrong or things that are like varying levels of wrong within design or appropriate. So wrong is a word that can refer to a number of different interactions. Maintainers might think certain things are correct, and it's kind of a tricky word to talk about because this kind of responds to the way that designers tend to design, not always, but they tend to design from a broad or specific user perspective. And sometimes that user perspective does not match with, say, a core maintainer's user perspective, or any maintainer's user perspective, or a very vocal developer's perspective in the open source software, and therefore it is seen as wrong. And that kind of comes back to this thing that on stream we've talked about before, that comes up in the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is like, if I created this open source software, me, the developer, then all of the other users are like me. And if they are submitting bugs, they are all submitting bugs that are the same kind of bugs that I would submit. Or if they're not, then those bugs get closed because they're not the right kind of user. They're not like me enough. or they just haven't figured it out like me. There's kind of a really tricky area around like how we understand users in open source software, and like the differing levels of users, like from beginner to expert to specific use to broad use, depending on the tool. But it's a big tricky thing. But regardless, when designers get feedback on the design that is specific to the design, and also next steps that are actionable. So something like, I see what you've done here in the design responds to this user need in this way. Have you explored this other user need that we know about based off of our maintainer knowledge? We think that researching that and including that within the next version of the design would be your next steps. That's an example of like one specific feedback and then actionable next steps. Oh, and then also like connecting that designer to somebody that can provide that insight would be incredibly helpful, actionable next steps. But there's an example of the actionable next steps. But yeah, success, lots of success measures. This is a slightly smaller one, which is about like design is successful if it's complete or released, like it actually goes into the open source software. Knowing what priorities are, super successful. There's a lot of conversation, as I've said in many talks about this, and other talks previous are like, there's often no clear roadmaps, or even like what designers should be kind of considering or working on, or could be working on as well, because I think this is maybe one of the things that doesn't get talked about as much around roadmaps and plans for implementation, which is, say you have an issue which is about improving as one aspect of a UI part in an open source software. A designer will look at that, or can look at that and go, okay, I can improve this part of the UI that's very specific, very limited, based off of the knowledge that I know that no other parts of the open source software tool will be changed anytime soon, that there are no plans to remove or change or completely drastically revamp that, or maybe the open source software actually has some plans about building another endpoint for the API which will change that kind of interaction. So a designer can look at things that in that kind of limited frame and not think about those things, but often designers do want to know the other things that would impact that piece of work, and they will often ask those questions. And I think that's why, I think one of the reasons that it gets frustrating for open source software projects to hear like, where's your roadmap, what are your plans, is because designers want to know those kinds of things so that they don't accidentally design or work on a problem that is intended to be changed in a drastic way or changed at some point. They want to consider what the other like implications are. Another success metric is attracting more designers into the open source software. If like other designers come in and contribute, that's seen as really good. Acknowledgement, inclusion, and collaboration. Basically, when designers are welcomed into the space, and that they get positive responses, essentially, on their work, which is not unusual. People like to be complimented and like appreciated for their work. And then this one is, I think, a really pivotal kind of one for design in open source, and kind of speaks to like the wider goals of designers typically. So a success metric for designers is, are you improving or working on the accessibility or usability overall of the open source software, and sometimes accessibility and usability overall of open source software everywhere. So yeah, the designers see as being like the voice of the user as like incredibly, like if they were able to communicate that through their work, they're very pleased, very successful, very happy. There's a whole section about communication, different communication nuances and quirks within this. And then specifically about the long cycle of communication in open source. So depending on a designer's familiarity with open source software generally, their context, their background, typically what we found from the respondents is the more open source softwares that they have been involved in or know about, like generally historically, the less expectations they have about quick communication cycles, quick implementation cycles. When a designer is a little bit newer in open source software or has a particular goal in mind, they're a little bit more surprised at how long it can take comparatively to the commercial software world about how design specifically is implemented into open source software. I'm just going to let the cat out. Right, you. Are you feeling better? Good. There you go. He must be feeling better, because if he's going to go outside, he will be feeling better. Anyway. There's a section about processes and decisions and how they're made. Often, actually, I think that one of the things that was absent in a lot of the decision-making section... Oh, hey, Bruno! Something that was completely absent from the responses around decision-making in open source software is I don't think that there was any mention that any designers were involved in decision-making processes. It's kind of like one of those things where the absence of data is informative as the data that is given or the responses that are given. So I'm pretty sure that none of the designers actually had indicated that they had like decision-making power, for lack of a better way of kind of describing it. It was a very like service-oriented and facilitative-oriented like function in open source software is the design side of things. I forgot that there's this section in the report. Sometimes when you write a 40-page report about something and you write it just about over a year ago now, you forget the things that you wrote, but it looks like there's a whole section on the users, who are the users and how designers are involved with users in open source software. I think this goes briefly into like how do you quantify or who qualifies as a user in different projects, which we talked about a little bit, maybe about 15 or 20 or so minutes ago. Oh, and there's this section about designers' lives. They're basically TLDR, designers are overwhelmed with design work and absence of like well-defined design work. They don't have enough time to do the kind of processes that they want to do, but often they find satisfactory ways of doing those. And then there's like going into like more of designers' lives. There's some interesting information about how they feel about being paid. It's an interesting topic because some of the designers, as you can sort of read here, they describe paid work means that work is more serious. But they also have higher expectations of the open source software project if they are being paid. So say that long communication cycle or feedback cycles for the designers, if they are being paid, they would have more expectations of the other people involved in the open source software if they're being paid, whereas they have less expectations about communications, processes, decision making if it's a volunteer contribution. But also, like, you know, typical things that you would find in many research pieces into open source software, like unpaid contribution causes burnout. I think this is really interesting for me, right? This is like a direct call out to GitHub, Sol's GitHub. But it is sad. This is a comment from one of the designers in the diary study. It is sad that some people get paid for the same things that you do, makes you feel bad. Sometimes I joke about GitHub stars and why is it only very technical people? Designers are doing essential work. Big organizations or programs that help recognize designers are needed. So I think this is really interesting because I was looking at GitHub stars and nominating some GitHub stars recently from like my own like people that I think are very important in the open source space. And I agree, like a lot of the people that get represented in open source and awarded in open source are the people that are more numerous, the developers, the coders, but they're getting paid for their work, whereas other functions, not just design, documentation, QA, other functions that are less, prevalent are not getting paid and not getting recognized. And I do think that there needs to be I think that there is a sort of a quantity ratio happening here. Maybe like because there are more developers being nominated for GitHub stars, but I also kind of think that there might need to be a reconsideration of the weighting of votes around that. So perhaps like, just, hey, GitHub, maybe you need to, if like some designers that are doing essential work in open source are getting slightly less votes, like community votes, maybe kind of weight them a little bit differently to be higher, because there are just going to be less of those people generally, but they're still doing essential work. It's not just about quantity. I actually, I could be completely wrong, and GitHub could be doing a completely different way of doing the stars voting system that isn't just about the number of votes that you get. It could be about the quality of the descriptions that you give when you're nominating a GitHub star as well, but you never know. So if that work is being done, thank you. If it's not, maybe check on like how you're looking at how people get awarded. And it's not just about GitHub stars, it's about all the different other ways that people are awarded. Designers in open source and their busy lives, and we're going to close out the stream in probably 10 minutes, just so that I've got a little break before my next I've got a meeting at the top of the hour. So yeah, they've got a lot of different goals. This is all stuff essentially that if designers had more time they would be doing. Contribute more to open source, having design work go live is like a goal, collaborating with others, finding a better way to organize design issues, diversity and inclusion work being recognized, taking time to explore, design and sketch more, coaching more people. And this is another section, kind of like I talked a lot at the beginning of the stream, or maybe towards the middle of the stream, about there's a section in this report about what questions designers ask themselves when they are thinking about contributing to a project. These are criteria that designers consider important when they're thinking about leaving a project or how they want to exit a project. There's some really sad stuff in this section about this aspect I talked about maybe towards the beginning of the stream, which was the amount of time that designers talked about and advocated for how to do design and why to do design than actually doing their design function. So comparatively, it would be like if you spent 10% of your time in your code writing tool actually writing code or developing code. If you did that 10% of the time and you did the rest, the other 90% of your time was spent justifying why you're writing that code and what that code is solving a problem for and who, that's the sort of comparison that designers are spending 80 to 90% of their time just talking about why they should do things, how, why, and that it's important, than actually doing the thing that they studied for or have always wanted to spend their time doing, which is design work. Wasting time makes them think about leaving projects. Some people don't feel safe continuing in projects if they don't get any responses, or there's a bad cycle of conversation within contributions. if they have to redo work that's already been done, often design doesn't get documented well. So it turns out like a lot of designers end up doing repeating work that has been previously done, but it's not well documented, and they're not encouraged to document well when they have done something. But these are the things that designers want to leave a project, like good things they want to have implemented into a project before they would really consider leaving, unless it was like, I have to leave for my own like sanity or health. So they want design work to be done and continues to be done in an open design software. Designers do use a lot of proprietary software, commercial software, but they would rather be using open source alternatives, and they would rather be able to spend the time using those alternatives and getting proficient in those alternatives, and having those alternatives have the, I know that this is a big ask, but like having feature parity between an open source alternative and a proprietary alternative is something that informs that choice as well. That design is left in a way that can be picked up, and that design is in a better place than it was before, to ensure that the maintainers know what has been done in the design side of things, and that it's handed over slowly and carefully, essentially just not ghosting a project. It looks like I didn't actually edit some of the typos in the markdown file, but anyway, knowing that design will change after a designer has gone, so acknowledging that, like, designers need to come to the realization that before they leave a project, that if they leave a project, other designers may come in and change those things, or other people may come in and change those things. That's a process that needs to be facilitated within the project, or by the designer within the project. But yeah, inspiring other designers to get involved as well. So if people are listening to this stream that have access or interest in doing more research work, either yourselves or want to explore some things, or if we as an organization, the organization I work for, if we ever get any more funding to do this kind of research again, we have like a whole heap of stuff that we would want to do, either like analyzing the existing data a little bit more intricately on specific things like I've mentioned on stream, or scaling up this work and doing more of it. So inviting more open source software projects to contribute. So one of the things that I think would be really interesting is the projects that designers are contributing to and doing diary studies about. We're focusing really on the designers in this diary study. What if we also talked to the open source projects about how those contributions are being accepted and the different perspectives? That would be really interesting. Better understanding the way that better understanding the ways in which different roles view design and designers alongside open source software. So that's like some of what we would ask open source software projects. Including different types of open source software projects. So I think that we got a good selection of different projects in this diary study, but there are still other kinds of open source projects that I would like to have designer diary studies like represented in this. Because there's so many different kinds of open source software projects. With 5 study participants, you're never going to cover like the breadth of different open source software projects. But yeah, essentially just doing this more, doing it for a longer period of time as well would be really, really good. Observing designers and also seeing if there are things that we can do to help those designers as they go through their journey. Interventions maybe. But yeah, I think one of the things that was really tricky, we always try and do this in the work that we do with Superbloom, but like we don't, you know, not everybody feels comfortable communicating in English. We were able to make sure that everybody had enough time to communicate what they wanted to in English, but there were certain things that even the participants in this diary study felt like they did their best to communicate in English as well as they could, but actually they would be able to express that much more comfortably in like their native like language that isn't English. Right, yeah. So we need more people involved in studies that are not just like, an open source software has just like such a dominance of like Western European and like the Northern American like English speaking as a culture. So that culture generally just needs to be more inclusive. And then it goes into all these recommendations, which are not as pretty in the Markdown folder as pretty as they are when you look at them in the slide deck, but they are still there. So there's lots of things that open source software projects can do to make things better. So that was like 1 hour 50 minutes about rambling on in much more detail about the open source software designer diary studies. If you find you have time to read the report, absolutely go for it. If you find you have time to read the report and make an annotated version of the document of things that you think are interesting, hey, you can contribute that annotated document version into this folder right here. If you have other things that you want to see studied, you can add an issue into the repository and say, hey, I really want to have this question answered about design in open source software, or this is what I want focused on the next time that this kind of study is done. If you want to start a discussion, absolutely start. I think I opened up the discussions. Yeah, each section of the report has a discussions thread opened about it that everyone can come in and talk about. And lastly, if you have another contribution that you can make is if you want to download the raw data and do your own analysis of the data, please absolutely go for it. If you then write a paper, if you write a blog post, or if you write anything about the things that you learned from either the raw data or the report, let us know in, I would say, either a discussion or an issue, and we can add it in as additional research into this repository. And I'm sure there are like loads of other things that people can contribute to this research study as and when. But really, like, the thing that I would love people to do is if people wanted to fork this repository and run their own diary study, there's templates, I suppose, here for running your own diary study. So that would be an excellent contribution as well. And we would be really interested in seeing your raw data if you run a similar study or the same study again. So with that, I'm going to go on to BigCam again, and I'm going to say thank you for whoever watched the stream for however long you watched the stream for or listened in. If you watch this on my YouTube channel as like the uploaded version of this video, thank you for listening in, even if you listened on double speed. I fully support people listening on double speed. And yeah, I hope that folks find this information really useful, and I hope that we get more funding to do more studies like it. With that, I'm going to sign off a few minutes early from the stream and say thank you to mostly a lot of my lovely friends that have dropped into the stream chat to be supportive. Thank you very much. And I'll see y'all around on the internet. Bye.